A heavy mist clung to the air, making it thick in the early morning of August 31st in 1888. Robert Paul was on his way to work when he stumbled upon a man hovering over a body of a woman lying motionless on the ground in Bucks Row, East London. It was 3:40 in the morning, so the darkness gripped the city so tightly it was hard to see what lingered in the distance. The sight of this mysterious man towering over a body made Robert apprehensive. As the man noticed him and moved closer, peering over at Robert, he said, "Come and look at this woman." Without knowing it, Robert Paul may have unwittingly stumbled upon Jack the Ripper's first canonical killing of Polly Nichols. I'm Crystal, and this is Everything is Spooky in the Dark, the podcast for WanderingCrystal.com. After my last podcast about the gruesome history of Jack the Ripper, one of my lovely listeners suggested I look into one specific person in the Jack the Ripper case. I received a comment from Hell's Bell on my Jack the Ripper podcast on YouTube, and they mentioned that one suspect in the Ripper case seemed incredibly suspicious. I briefly mentioned this man and Robert Paul on my last podcast as two men on their way to work, and that was it. So who was this man that I casually glossed over? Charles Cross, who is also known as Charles Lechmere. Just like the police, I didn't suspect a thing. I was so focused on Aaron Kosminski and Joseph Barnett, but the real culprit was lurking in the shadows all along. I dismissed him because in murder cases, it's always those early morning joggers that find dead bodies. I thought that this guy just had a bad luck day as he found a body early in the morning on his way to work and moved on. Until I had more detail. On the night that Robert Paul walked by Charles Cross, standing over the lifeless body of Polly Nichols, whose full name is Mary Ann Nichols, Robert thought that she had just passed out. He checked her breathing, he felt a weak breath, possibly her last, and he touched her skin and noticed that she was freezing. He believed that she may have been dead, but he wasn't certain. He suggested they prop her up, but Charles declined by saying that he did not want to touch her. What Robert was unaware of, that just below her skirt was her recently mutilated body. With no obvious signs of blood around Polly, the two men decided to find a police constable to help the poor woman. As they were walking towards Hanbury Street, they found Constable Myuu and told him about the lifeless woman in need of assistance. While Robert Paul and Charles Cross talked to Constable Myuu, just a few roads over on Bucks Row, Constable Neal stumbled upon the dead body of Polly Nichols. When Charles and Robert found Constable Myuu, Charles mentioned another police officer was at the scene waiting for his assistance. Seeing the men as mere messengers, Myuu let them go without questioning. So what threw Charles Lechmere back into the Jack the Ripper suspect spotlight? Especially after being seen with the first victim, yet is free to go on his merry way after speaking to a police constable? Robert Paul made mention of him in the newspaper. It was first reported that Constable Neal was the first person to come across Polly Nichols' dead body. That was until Robert Paul spoke to the papers and told them that he and Charles were the first people to discover Polly. Charles decided to speak to the police about being at the crime scene, which many people believe he did to cast off any suspicions. If he had reached out to the police, they wouldn't be looking for him, making him look innocent. It worked. Charles' name as Charles Cross and his address were in police reports and the papers a few times. But that was the end of his ties to the Ripper murders. Charles Cross didn't officially become a suspect until Ripperologists combed through information in about 2005 to 2015. They started looking into the genealogy of Charles Cross. They discovered his name was actually Charles Lechmere. The fact that Charles lied to the police about his name made him quite distrustful. He never gave the name Lechmere throughout the case, and he was always reported as Charles Cross. His stepfather was named Cross, which is where he got the name, but once his stepfather passed, he went by the name Charles Lechmere. So what makes Charles Lechmere so suspicious? And how did he become one of the most interesting suspects in the Jack the Ripper murder cases? Charles worked as a carman, a delivery person, and made his way through the Whitechapel district on Monday through Saturday on his walk to work. The area was quite poor, overcrowded, dirty, and had poorly lit streets. The district was lined with lodging houses, places where people would sleep if they didn't have a place to live. The area had a large number of sex workers and crime. As people looked into the history of Charles Lechmere's early life, he has a lot in common with serial killers that have been profiled in modern times. He came from a broken home, never knew his biological father, and moved around many times. At the time of the murders, he was 39 years old, married and a father of 12. He was quite close to his mother, living with her until suddenly moving out 2 months before the murders in Whitechapel began. As Charles was a delivery person, he started work very early. The walk to work was a 40-minute walk, and his route took him right through the region where the Jack the Ripper murders took place. He worked at his job for 20 years and he knew the area very well. Although there are a few murders that occurred before Polly Nichols that could have very well been done by Jack the Ripper, such as the death of Martha Tabram, who was killed near the George Yard buildings, which was on Charles' route to work, to the Pinchin Street torso, where pieces of a woman's body were found in Pinchin Street in East London. The official victim of Jack the Ripper was Polly Nichols. Charles' walk to work took him directly past Robert Paul's house. They would walk the same route every morning, but on the morning of Polly's death, neither man saw the other on their walk to work. When Robert spotted Charles and Polly, he mentioned that he saw no other person running off or in the general area that could have committed the crime. People suspect that Charles was alone with the body of Polly a lot longer than he reported. However, as she died by strangulation, it could have taken as little as 2 minutes to strangle her to death. She had fewer injuries than other Jack the Ripper murders, which suggested that he had been interrupted during the murder. Unlike the murders that happened later, Polly still had her organs intact and hidden by her skirt. Future Ripper murders would have the brutal mutilations on display for all to see. The reason that Robert Paul may not have seen a pool of blood surrounding Polly is due to her cause of death. If she had been strangled to death or near death, her blood pressure would have been very low, causing a blood-free killing. Charles had the time to kill Polly and had no alibi, making him incredibly suspicious in her death. The Ripper's next victim, Annie Chapman, was found in Hanbury Street, which was on Charles' direct route to work. The next 2 victims, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, both women were murdered on the same night, were killed away from Charles' regular walk to work. However, the area they were murdered was near one of the houses that Charles grew up in. Plus, they were murdered on a Saturday night, and as Sunday was Charles' only day off of work, he may have been in the area visiting his mother, putting him in the location at the times the double murder occurred. The last victim, Mary Jane Kelly, was killed on Dorset Street, which was also on Charles' route to work. As you may remember from the last podcast episode, Mary Kelly was murdered inside the lodging house she had previously shared with Joseph Barnett. The murder was one of the most gruesome and bloody killings of all. The murderer would have been covered in blood, making it seem impossible for him to walk down the street going unnoticed. Historian Arthur Ingram is an expert on Pickfords, which was the company that Charles Lechmere worked for as a delivery man. During the time he worked there, Charles delivered meat. So if he had been covered in blood, it would have not seemed out of place based on his work. All of the evidence that piles up against Charles is pretty damning. The fact that he was found with the first victim and her wounds were fresh, to lying to the police about his name and details of the evening, to the fact that his walk to work placed him at the scene of the murders, and the others were near his mother's house. Plus the fact that he wore clothes that would be covered in blood due to his job made it easy to make a huge suspect in all of the murders. Charles ended up living until he was 71, but the killings, as we know them, stopped after the death of Mary Kelly. If, unlike the other suspects, Charles was not arrested or moved out of the area, why did he stop killing? Serial killers usually continue killing until they are caught, but he lived well into old age. That is just one reason that people may believe he wasn't Jack the Ripper. Another argument against Charles being the Ripper is that some people believe you wouldn't kill on your way to work, and others wonder why he wouldn't run away when Robert Paul discovered him with Polly's body. You would think that if he were guilty, he wouldn't stick around. There are so many theories about so many different suspects. Most men, but there is even a theory that the killer was a woman. If you want to step inside the world of ripperologists, you can read their theories depending on which suspect they are discussing. I'm glad that it was suggested that I look deeper into Charles Cross / Charles Lechmere, because based on what people have pulled from combing through history, he seems incredibly suspicious. He could easily be at every crime scene, and a lot of the things he did made him seem really guilty. Is there someone that you think is more suspicious than Charles Lechmere, Joseph Barnett, or Aaron Kosminski? And are there any theories that seem too far-fetched on these or any of the other suspects? Let me know. Thank you to Hell's Bell and Jack the Ripper, the missing evidence, for the information about Charles Lechmere. Thank you so much for listening to Everything is Spooky in the Dark. Visit wanderingcrystal.com for dark history travel locations that you should visit someday.